My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Daniela Cambone, who a lot of you have seen as far as Stansberry research. We're going to get into a deep dive around her background as well as talking about the digital dollar concept. Daniela, for those who are not familiar with your background, just talk about who you are, how did you get involved in markets, and what are you doing with Stansberry?
All right. Well, first of all, happy Sunday morning to everyone. How did I get involved in the markets? A very, very long time ago. And not to bore everyone, but when I was coming out of journalism school, I never thought I thought I was going to be covering politics. To be honest with you, that was the kind of the road I was on. And then when I got out of J school, I was offered work for a magazine that now no longer exists in Montreal that came with La Presse, if anyone is from Montreal, called Magazine Finance, which covered the insurance and banking sector. And I remember I went for that interview, met with the editors, and they're like, what's your background in finance? And I was like, absolutely none. And they're like, perfect. And they kind of took me under their wings. And that was kind of my breeding ground. And I fell in love with covering economics and finance and all of that. And I just never looked back. But how did I get to Stansberry? Well, I did that for a few years. Then I moved to Rome, lived there, was covering finance industry. I moved back to North America, where I was recruited by Kitco to start basically Kitco News. So I was employee number one. I remember I went in for the interview. And they're like, what do you know about gold? And I'm like, actually, I've never covered gold, knew nothing about it at the time. And here I am still covering gold. So I kind of just fell in love with commodities and covering that market and started Kitco News from scratch, hired the whole team there and ended up doing that for 12 years, led it as editor-in-chief. And then during the pandemic and during a pregnancy with twins, was poached by Stansberry Research. They liked what I did at Kitco and said, can you recreate the magic? And I thought, oh my gosh, starting from scratch again, starting a media department from scratch again. But here we are. In less than a year, I brought them to 500,000 subscribers on YouTube and just trying to replicate that magic and keep giving people the content that they want to hear that you're not going to find on mainstream media. So that's really what we aim to do is provide that alternative financial voice that you're really not going to get from, CNBC or Bloomberg or any of these channels, and bring on amazing guests like Michael, like you. And just thank you for having me on the flip side today.
I want you to talk about some of the differences between mainstream and what you think people need to hear, because there is this belief out there that there's almost like a directive that comes from above, right, with a lot of the traditional media outlets, whether it's regular news or financial news. What is it that you think mainstream media does right and does wrong?
That's a very, very good question. And I did work for mainstream media, and I think there is this impression that there's like this Darth Vader type person saying you need to push this agenda, and that's not really the case. But you do have advertisers, right? So if you're working for the traditional media like CNBC, I mean, you cover the stock market and that's all you hear. You just cover equities. They're not going to be covering gold. I mean, they started covering crypto because it's popular and it drives traffic, but they're not going to cover other assets except for equities. So then when you're working on Wall Street or you're consuming that, that's what you see as the only investment path. And the danger there is, well, first of all, it's just so completely one-sided. And on the other side of the equation, they don't teach you about alternative assets and investing in school. So it's like, where are you going to get that knowledge from? And I think that's where alternative financial news is really important, because we do cover different assets or different ways of thinking, except, and everyone that appears on mainstream media, it's almost like it's all the same bandwidth. You're not going to get divergent opinions. You're not going to have a discussion about the coming digital dollar and what it means for you. You're also having very short sound bites. You can't really have an in-depth hour discussion because, like I said, they have to sell advertising space, right? So how can you bring on a great guest and just, dilute the interview to 2 minutes? You're not going to get into anything. You're not going to be able to flesh out these ideas that people are really hungry for. And I think that's why channels like ours are so successful.
I mean, I think in fairness, the focus on equities, you can argue makes some sense, right? Because we've been in this prolonged bull market, and you want to give the audience what they ask for. And there probably is, let's face it, some degree of wanting to court sponsors and advertisers too, which you're only going to get from the public equity space, I'm going to presume.
Yeah, yes, I do agree. And by the way, these shows are beautifully produced. They're highly entertaining. They have great music. But I feel like people, if you're just consuming that content, you might not know of other options. So of course you're just going to keep consuming that content because it's speaking to your portfolio. So how can people get educated and be exposed to, things that are outside of the traditional system?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Now I remember I was on a show for a moment in time in 2012, 2013, where there was I was co-hosting a kind of daily recap of markets. And during the break when the commercials were running, I asked the primary anchor, how are ratings at the media outlet? And he said to me, well, ratings correlate to the VIX.
Hmm.
And I smiled. I knew what he meant, obviously, but I was trying to, poke him a little bit and say, well, so does that mean that you have a hidden incentive to create a degree of fear? And then the response was, oh, we're back here with Michael Guy. The commercial break ended. I want you to talk about the interplay of market volatility with ratings and how that can maybe impact the subject matter. Because if you're a media company, you're not making money from your investments, you're making money from advertisements. But to get advertisements, you have to have eyeballs. To have eyeballs, you have to have something going on in markets to get people concerned, want to know what's going on.
Absolutely. I would have to agree that volatility in media is your friend. and and even though, like I said, there might not be a specific directive like push fear or push this, if you're the anchor or whatever, we're all very competitive with our numbers with traffic, right? And you see the headlines and you look at the content that's winning, and most of the time you'll find a common denominator. So what you're going to try to do is just keep delivering that content. Now you might argue, okay, well, that's what the audience wants to hear, so is it a disservice to the audience if that's what they're clicking on? I mean, that's a whole conversation that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I definitely agree that when you're in no man's land and market, you definitely see the translation over in traffic. At least I do. Like if markets or gold or whatever it is, Bitcoin isn't doing anything, then of course you're going to have less things to talk about. But if, Bitcoin, whatever, crashes down to 12,000, or gold's going to go through 2,000 or whatever it is, of course, that volatility just brings more eyeballs and more traffic. And to your point of like, does fear sell? Yeah, I think that a lot of times people do tend to click on more of those headlines. And, I think there's a whole discussion around psychology we could have around that as, do people just like hearing bad news more than good news? I mean, even if we just look at the front covers of newspapers for the longest time, there's been an argument like, why don't we put more good news? Why is it always about stabbings and wars and whatever? Well, that just tends to sell more. Does.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of it's an interesting dilemma because everyone tends to rant against traditional media for that messaging or that tone, but it's kind of like, who do you blame, right? Do you blame the waiter that's serving the food or the person that's ordering it?
Exactly. I don't, and I know at one point I think there was even a newspaper that came out, like the Good News newspaper. There was like a test to show like what happens if we just put good news out and maybe we can all unite as journalists. But maybe there's just not a lot of good news out there, especially if you're looking at the markets. It's not like we're making this stuff up, right? So I don't know what the good news is right now, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess contrarian would say the good news is when there's nothing but bad news, right? Which is
Right.
sort of the argument that nobody knows what tomorrow brings. So if everybody's one sided, it's better to be contrarian. But I am curious to hear your thoughts, Daniela, on, because you mentioned you originally thought you were going to do journalism as it relates to politics.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a common thread in terms of covering politicians versus covering financial markets, because you can argue that one of the reasons why you don't have tough questions to politicians is because journalists want access. I can make a similar argument to journalists wanting access to the portfolio managers of these multi-billion-dollar type of firms, that they don't ask them the tough questions as to why they're performing the way they're performing, or why they're inconsistent in the way they approach things.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. And I hated covering politics. I much prefer to cover financial news, just because I hated the scrums. I hated like waiting. I mean, this was early on in my journalism career, but like waiting outside for a politician to emerge, and then you're like 30 journalists huddling around, shoving a microphone in their face. Um, I really didn't enjoy that, but you're right. Um, a lot of the times as a journalist, you get the scoop or you get the story because of your relationship and your network. And then when you have said source on your show, you have to remain objective as a journalist. And unfortunately, I don't know how many do that, Michael. So you're right. I would love to tell you journalism is alive and strong, but I think it's in its weakest state ever.
All right, so let's keep going with that point, sort of the state of journalism. So I remember reading this book. I forget the exact name of it, but it made the argument that as the world transitioned towards 24/7 media, that's when you started having a lot of focus on charts, on technical analysis, because you may not have too much to cover about something company specific, but there's always something to talk about in terms of a chart pattern, or in terms of some particular trend line changing, whatever it would be. I don't know if you've ever given thought to this, but I do wonder your thoughts on if you think the media makes it seem like trading is easy because you can see these lines on a chart, because they talk about it always and extrapolate out the most recent past and the future. If that actually creates sort of this culture of not wanting to do real due diligence because you can just pull up a price.
I would. So to that point, and I think with the other danger, if I can add to when we went 24/7 news, is that anyone could be a reporter now, right? Like I remember the day when you had to go to journalism school. Like I graduated from journalism. When I was hiring for my team at Kitco, whatever, I hired people who had a journalism degree. And I did that because I wanted trained journalists. Now, I wanted people who took like courses like ethics and journalism. Um, and now anyone can claim they're a journalist because anyone can be on Twitter. And that just goes back to your other point of, the news that's getting out there, and traffic and ratings. Like we all want, the highest number of eyeballs, but now we're competing against anyone that has a Twitter account or a YouTube channel. I mean, the field is just huge. And a lot of times, because speed is of the essence, to your point of let's just pull up a chart and we water down trading, we don't go in depth into a topic, because maybe doing investigative journalism, which I feel is dead now, requires months of research. And you have to be putting out daily content in order to stay relevant. Well, how can I do deep dive daily content? Right? So, my concern is that the research is not being done. People are no longer breaking stories. And again, I'm just really concerned for the state of journalism, which is a profession I obviously love. It is near and dear to my heart. But as a journalist myself, I see how hard it is to stay afloat and keep on top when you're dealing with all this noise and everyone looking to be a journalist. Okay, so to add, so yeah, so it's interesting. That ended up being the greatest Bitcoin gold debate ever to take place. And I'm honored I was part of it. Would I want to repeat it? I don't think so. I mean, I would probably only do it with Saylor and Justra again, 3 or 4 years down the line, or maybe 2 years down the line. But I say that because it was probably one of the hardest things I did in my career, not in terms of like the moderation itself, but all the conversations leading up to that debate. I felt like a lot of times in my work, I have to act like a divorce mediator almost, like, and here you're dealing with two titans on extremely opposing points of view. And at one point, I didn't know if even the debate was going to happen because Saylor wanted to get some talking points in, and obviously also Frank, but Saylor wanted certain topics to be covered. So it was just this back and forth of, is this debate even going to happen? Because I need to get them to the table. So that was a very challenging task that, looking back, I'm very proud of it, and I'm obviously thrilled with the outcome. But I like locked myself in a room for weeks preparing for that debate. Like, I was like in a very dark place because the amount of pressure. I mean, looking back, I think it's great, but yeah, it was no easy feat. And was Justra? I mean, Frank has always been a goal person, so I mean, his roots are gold. I think he even said in the debate that, yeah, he's I'm sure invested in Bitcoin as a speculative player, or was at one point, but his belief system, and I can't talk for Frank, but
Sure.
I would argue is definitely not in Bitcoin. I don't know. I can't speak to that, but he's a businessman. At the end of the day, if there was an opportunity in Bitcoin, I believe that he'd probably do it. But in terms of his beliefs, and does he think that, I could assure you that he is 1,000% believer in gold. Has never wavered from it. How that debate came up was actually Frank Justra. Oh, this might be an interesting story. So he called me and said he was just so disappointed with the rhetoric that Saylor was pointing out. I think it was a time when he was telling people, like, mortgage your house, get in Bitcoin. And he's like, I've had enough. This is just so reckless and irresponsible. And I want to debate Michael Saylor. He's like, can you make this happen? And I was like, well, let me try. Like, let me start the conversation with Saylor. And at the start, Saylor was having none of it. He did not want to do a debate. He had no interest. He didn't need to do the debate. He was just on fire during that time. He had all the exposure in the world, and he's like, why would I want to do a debate? I don't need to debate it. So there was all this back and forth, and I was like, Frank, I don't think it's going to happen. And then I think it was Remembrance Day, and it was my day off, and I was at the post office or something, and all of a sudden I get a random call from Michael Saylor when I thought this was just not going to happen anymore. And he was like, you know what? Let's do it. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah, let's do it. I was like, all right. It's like all of a sudden he just had a change of heart. It was like, I want to make this debate happen. And that's kind of how it went down. And then, like I said, there was all this back and forth about certain topics. And I mean, we only had an hour. So it was like, what were the topics we were going to cover? Because obviously there's just so many rabbit holes we could go down. But, ultimately, yeah, I'm thrilled with the result. And after that, like, so many people called me, wanted to do other debates, like, let's do this debate. And I was like, no, I'm not going to touch it. It was great. And I don't want to add to it. I don't want to take away from it. I'm not interested in doing another debate. Like I said, it would probably only be with Justra and Saylor, but a few years from now.
Do you So this is interesting. I wonder if because let's face it, clickbait does work.
Of
I hate to
course.
say it, but it does. I mean, people complain about titles and headlines all the time, but again,
But then they click on it.
But then they click on it, right?
Yeah.
And and if you're running a media entity, and listen, I partially do that myself. This is all happening through, which is like my media arm to some extent. I often see people complaining about how the titles of some of these spaces that I put together are all doom and gloom. And the reality is people don't click on it if there isn't some degree of negative narrative to it. And it's not necessarily one of those things where me as the person putting these titles together that I necessarily believe in that, but you have to get people in the door to start talking to them. So do you think that we've gotten to a point in media where you increasingly have to sound, in terms of getting people in the door, more bombastic, more extreme, more maxi, that you have to, as a pundit, say things like mortgage your house to buy Bitcoin to get attention, or is that always been something that's been sort of a dynamic over the last many years? I'm trying to get to
Yeah,
the point, this question of
you're
whether
right.
things have become more extreme in rhetoric because they have to be.
And I'm going to be straight up with you. That has to be the case. It wasn't the case when you had print, right? Well, in a way, it was, and that's why National Enquirer, beat all sales of anything. But it became more so the issue with digital. And back to your other point, who do you get angry with, the person ordering the food or the waitress or waiter? Uh, I feel that there's a lot of work, if you're serious about what you do, that goes behind creating content, booking the guests, the research. So imagine you do all this work, right, Michael, like you do, and I do, and other folks do. And then you don't want 500 people watching it, right? You want hundreds of thousands of people watching it. So now I got to sell it, right? And I personally don't want to sell it with a skewed view or untruthful view, but how am I going to get people through that front door? It's your welcome mat. And when I was training, the journalists I hired for success in creating, what was Kitco News and now Stansberry, I always say that's 99% of your battle. You have to have a good guest. You have to have a good content. You have to be a good interviewer. You need that. But how are you going to get people through the door? You need a strong headline. It's just part of the game. So I sleep well at night. I'm not thinking like, oh, that headline was really out there. I mean, sometimes I'll see headlines and I'm like, dude, that was just so far out there. Like, and I think people will click on it once, but then realize like you're just delivering duds. But I think if you deliver home runs and you deliver good content, there's nothing wrong with having what I call a strong headline. You just have to have a strong headline or it's not going to work. And now you did all this work and no one's going to watch it and know about it.
Right, and it's important that that headline is not reflective of your belief. It's reflective of what you think the audience wants to hear about. I've seen people like with some of my spaces that since I released these as podcasts, say, "Oh, Guy was wrong again when I said, as the title of a podcast, Lead Lag Live, oil is about to explode. 3 months ago, meaning higher. It wasn't because I believe that; it's because that's what the guest believed."
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, and I always say that I was editing. Okay, so I'll share something. We'll have guests on like Robert Kiyosaki, for example, who I'm sure you've interviewed, and we'll say things out there. And then some editors will flag and be like, oh, what he said here was, and I know that editor, for example, has no idea what our audience is. And I'm thinking that's exactly what our audience wants to hear. You can't flag that. So you have to know your audience. Like my audience, I would say, is primarily anti-Fed, anti-system, probably libertarian, mostly male, pretty wide age group. Huge interest in commodities, interest in crypto, distrust of system, right? So when I bring on a person, a source, I see it who's like bullish America or like bullish equities right now. It just doesn't do well. Now I still bring them on, and I'll know when I'm booking a guest. I'll know if they're going to be a hit or not. Like I'll know if it's going to get good views or not immediately. But I do still bring on that contrarian point of view, even though I know it's not necessarily going to get the eyeballs, but I feel I would be doing a disservice if I just kept pushing the same angle and narrative. Whereas other journalists are like, well, I'm just going to keep pushing it because I know that works. I think you have to remain balanced, even though certain videos are not going to bring you the eyeballs you necessarily would be happy with. So that's kind of the onus I put on myself. So I'll know this source is probably not going to resonate at all with the audience, but I feel I need to bring this viewpoint on.
I promise everybody here we're going to touch on the digital dollar. I just think this is an interesting context in the world of media because I'm myself trying to walk that fine line as somebody who's managing assets, but also trying to build this sort of media arm to these type of spaces. Okay, you said something which I know from the data that I've seen, and I don't know how to think about this. You said the audience is mostly male and distrusts the system. And often, I used to have this analytics thing on the background that would say, okay, what percentage of these spaces are male versus female, what age range, and pretty consistently 85% of financial spaces that I myself have run are males, right? Um, but you can argue unequivocally that women should be more concerned about the financial system than men are, because just from the standpoint of raising a family, worrying about debt,
Absolutely.
about having, feeding your family, making sure your babies have a comfortable future when they're adults, right? So, why is it that that more men are focused on the financial markets than women? And I know that's a very broad statement, but it's always been fascinating to me because I just think it there should be a better balance there.
Well, that's a really, I mean, it's an excellent question. Um, and I just want to start by saying I do feel it's changing. Like I have many more women now than when I started my career will email me and thank me for the content. Happy to see a female financial anchor, um, and who are on who maybe just have a huge wealth transfer given to them, or maybe their husbands passed and now they're all of a sudden in charge of the money and they don't know what to do, where to look. And then there are a lot of women that I'm encountering that are financially savvy, and I'm like, yes, yay, yes, take charge. But Michael, the roots of this go back to school. Honestly, like what women are encouraged to pursue and what men are encouraged to pursue. I mean, I could argue why are most financial classes or degrees filled with men, and why are psychology and sociology classes mostly filled with women. So, and again, I'm not a psychologist or sociologist, but that's even reflecting on my academics, it was encouraged, oh, I should, pursue political science or history, the social sciences. I never knew that I could fall in love with economics. So maybe I didn't love math in high school, right? And I wasn't encouraged to pursue it. But then all of a sudden I realized, wait, but I really get economics. I get how that works. And unfortunately, and I actually gave a speech about this when I was asked to go back to my high school, which was an all girls school. And my message to the girls was, don't let people pigeonhole you. Okay. Don't let people tell you, oh, you're not good in math. So, you know what? You shouldn't think about going into commerce, because you don't know. That's just one part of it. And it just angers me beyond, because, like I said, you can fall in love and you should understand economics. You should understand the value of a dollar. What is money? You should understand what drives all this. But unfortunately, we're not presented with that. Um, and so here we are today. Well, yeah, well, we're most of the men make the financial decisions in the house. I'm not saying that's the right thing, because women need to be educated, but the roots are in our education system that is just so flawed.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with that across the board. All right, so value of a dollar. So this becomes sort of an interesting pivot then to the name of the space, which is the digital dollar reset. Now, I want you. You said to me that you wanted to express your concern about digital dollars, and that we're probably getting closer to that point than people think. Talk about, from your own research, why you're concerned about CBDCs, aside from sort of the popular narratives around control, but maybe that is the main thing. And who are some of the guests you've had on that really kind of opened your eyes to some of the positives and negatives that could be coming as a result?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think there's many positives. But when I say that I'm concerned, and this goes back to the discussion of mainstream media and information that's being pushed to the masses, is that I don't believe this is a broad discussion. I believe this is still a very much, this is not a conversation happening at most dinner tables. This is still a very, in my opinion, niche conversation, or safe for channels like ours. And I'm concerned with the recent rhetoric and agenda from the White House, that I didn't think it would be happening as soon as I think it's going to be coming, at least in the US, much quicker than I originally thought. And I'm, concerned, you mentioned it, because people are not going to understand or don't realize the repercussions on our privacy and just total control. And there's 105 active countries currently working on a central bank digital currency, and it's like, where are we talking about this? Why are we not having a conversation about this on the mainstream media? I would say, go out, stop 4 people on the sidewalk, and ask them if they even know about this. And I would bet that most have no clue that this is happening. And I'm afraid that it's going to come in under the radar, like, oh, this is a positive, like, we're not cutting down trees, and there's no longer, we're not going to have to be touching dirty money anymore, and this is great. um and that we're just, most people are just going to get blindsided and not understand what's happening here.
And China's tried this, right? Let's talk about sort of what we've seen so far in
Yeah.
terms of attempts.
Well, what I think is, and to just go back to your other point, I mean, guests that I've had on, I mean, William Middlecote has done extensive research on it. Frank Justra has an interesting take on it. Um, Rick Rule. I mean, I would say most of my guests. Oh, E.B. Tucker has been saying, has been talking about the Fed dollar and warning about it. Doug Casey, for years, and they're all people who have been right in the past with other calls. And one point that Justra brings up that I would have to agree with, is that we don't. I mean, they put out numbers in terms of how much gold they're buying every many years, but we don't really know how much gold they have. Whatever they mine stays in the country, and there is the theory that whatever central bank digital currency they release will most likely be backed by gold. So, could I see that being a possibility? Yes. So yeah, that's
And the China sort of experiment. I don't know how much you've researched on that, but talk about what China has attempted to do and how successful or not successful it's been so far.
I don't know I don't know how successful or unsuccessful it's been, but they obviously tried to roll out a central bank, a digital currency. Um, and I believe what it's created is just an underground network. But again, I don't know or have sources that I can trust coming out of there in terms of accuracy. Maybe you probably know more than I do, Michael, in terms of what you're hearing from China.
No, I mean, so I'll be honest. I'm conflicted on several aspects of the discussion around CBDCs because I can't argue that there are some interesting positives. For example, the idea that stimulus can expire, right?
Right.
So if you do, if it's a token that gets sent out to everybody in a country, and the government says, listen, it's almost like a coupon, right? This expires by this time, this day on at midnight. That to me is an interesting way of creating velocity of money, right? To counter disinflation or deflationary shock. So I can argue that you can say is interesting and positive to some extent. But there are other elements there, of course, which is that you can then conceivably buy off in a democracy voters. So, for example, and I want your
Right.
thoughts on this, right? This idea that some ethnic minority or group of a society is not particularly favorable towards your political party. Okay, well then let's send some stimulus directly in a digital form to that subsegment of society on the hopes that that will ingratiate our possibility of getting voted in by a party or a group that normally wouldn't want us in power.
Absolutely. And I think, just made me think of another point. I think the broader discussion, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is okay, other obviously positives. Yeah, it cracks down on the black market, on criminals, getting paid under the table, taxation dollars, get all that, right? So what is the better outcome? Well, they'd have total control and knowledge of how we spend our money, right? So how would you argue it? Is it better to crack down on that black market, or that we lose any any privacy that we may have left?
Right, and that's the exact sort of dilemma. But you said it correctly. It's like any privacy we have left. It's like even the idea that cash is not traceable is not fully true because there's cameras everywhere, and you can effectively somewhat kind of, even though it's harder, right? You can kind of always go back to a source. I would argue to some extent. So I guess it's a question of easier loss of privacy versus more obfuscated, but still loss of privacy.
Exactly. And and I know there's the argument, well, we already have loss of privacy because most people use credit cards or debit cards, but it's just kind of like that option of, I want to just be able to pay this whatever, or I don't want the government to know, every single aspect of my life. And I just believe that we're going to lose all that freedom. And if every country is working on it, I mean, where's a safe place? Maybe that will be that will be a favorable angle for the country that doesn't move towards, central bank digital currencies as a way to get people to move there. Who knows?
I wonder also if there's a political bent to this in terms of liberal versus conservative.
Yeah.
Right. Because I haven't really kind of thought through this too much. But again, if the idea is that with a digital currency, you can target stimulus to a particular segment of the population, that maybe you can argue would be more what liberals want the ability to do, right? To
Yeah.
write, past societal ills and errors and things like that. And you can argue that there's maybe a degree of validity to that, but I suspect you wouldn't see the sort of same excitement around conservative thinkers.
Right. I was actually thinking about that the other day too. I was like, if there was a Republican in power, would it change things? I don't know. And it's a very valid point. And it'd be interesting to see. It's funny because someone said to me, oh, well, then you could just, move back to Canada once the US launches it. I'm thinking, well, Canada's going to be right behind whatever the US launches it. So, but it is an interesting, I don't know if it changes given the political party.
Speaking of Canada, because I had somebody send me a DM asking your thoughts on Trudeau, Canada's economy, markets. Here in the States, you see things that seem to be insane in terms of what Canada's policies seem to be. But you also have insane things with California putting stimulus out to pay for inflation. So I'm just curious from your vantage point, how do you think about Canada's markets and how the economy is being impacted by, let's call it, non-free market dynamics?
Yeah, I'm and I generally try to stay away from political topics, but I'm just greatly disappointed with Trudeau and his direction. And I think I echo the views of many Canadians who perhaps had even voted for Trudeau and are just very disappointed in the direction that the country has taken. Specifically, and I don't want to talk about the pandemic or COVID, but specifically, how it was really how he handled the entire situation and the policing of it all. And, I was in Canada for a lot of it. I was going back and forth, and it was just horrific being there. And what's interesting is that when I was living in Canada full time, you couldn't really see the full picture because I was speaking to folks there, like even my family, and they were just so in this bubble they couldn't see outside that they had just accepted it as a norm, like whatever rules they were imposing. And I was like, no, guys, like you have a right to choose. So but you kind of just get sucked into this vacuum of when you're almost living there all the time that you can't see outside of it. But I think that Canada is really just on the same course as the US. I don't think that they're in any better shape at all. And yeah, I would say I'm overall very disappointed with the direction of the country.
Yeah, I feel like
And I
that's,
think
that's
this as
something
a
you can
proud
apply to
Canadian.
everybody.
I'm a proud Canadian. I love Montreal, but just that's just a whole other topic. The direction of Quebec politics is just absolutely terrifying right now.
But I feel like that's a dynamic in every country at this point. It's like, I'm sure if you were to ask any citizen anywhere in the world about their local government, and they'd say probably, yeah, the politics are terrifying, right? In terms of either who's ever in power now or who might be in power next, right? There's a constant frustration. Nobody's ever seemingly happy with the existing state of things. And I am curious, and let's go back to the role of media. Do you think that a lot of the frustrations that citizens have around their governments, is it because they feel they are being lied to or misled by traditional media, which have their own political bents, or do you think this is sort of an awakening that maybe inflation is starting to push people to think a little bit more about the current state of things?
I think a lot of, going back to your point about journalists, feeling they need to, placate to the politicians. I think a lot of that happens with Trudeau. And I'm just so sick and tired of opening, any Canadian paper that's more liberal and, seeing another selfie with Trudeau or him singing Bohemian Rhapsody. I hate all this nonsense. I'm like, can you just stop this? And I know people like to see that human side, but I want you to be focused and help the country. I don't need to see another selfie or you dressed up in some costume. I hate all of that. All the theatrics of it. I hate it. I so I think that, getting back to your point, really, I think there is a lot of feeling like they have to just appease him or deliver whatever he'd want to see to keep him on their good side to get whatever they need to get, unfortunately. Or they can't even see beyond it. Like I said, a lot of times they're just in this bubble that they think it's great that he's with the people. He's not with the people.
Yeah, no, and I shared in the Nest tweet that I put out, which got a lot of engagement, which kind of touches on that point. So I myself am, as I've been rage tweeting the last week, have been wildly disturbed by financial markets because I keep going back to this idea that
Yeah.
what's happening with treasury, when you have this type of movement in treasuries, you're talking about something very, very serious in terms of the system beyond portfolios, because the entire system is predicated on long duration, so-called quote unquote risk-free treasuries. So I put out that tweet. I said I can't help but look around in the airport, wondering how clueless people are to what's going on in financial markets, how
I
devastating
saw
it's going
that.
to become, right? And basically, as everyone's distracted by all this bullshit of people taking
Yeah.
selfies with Trudeau and all this stuff. So, and I know Stansberry and other entities like Kitco as well, right? Try to put a spotlight on this stuff, but correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle, probably a lot of your audience are recurring audience members. So you're not necessarily, it's hard to reach out to the people that are easily distracted that need to hear these things when they're so into the Instagram post of the moment or the selfie of the moment, whatever it is. So how do you try to convey to people that are not in financial markets how seriously things are playing out here? And then of course the corollary to that is, even if they did know, could they do anything about it?
I don't think you can really reach them, Michael. I really because there's an ease, right, of just getting sucked into the Instagram vortex. It's much easier to just accept it and go along with it and be like, "Oh, this is great. We're in La La Land. Let's take more selfies." It's much easier to not use that brain space, right? So, at least from my point of view, I don't think I'm going to change those folks or get them to think otherwise because they're happy thinking that way. So I almost think it's like wasted energy. The new audience is that audience. You have to have that willingness to be open minded. So that's those are the people we can just keep reaching. The person that's maybe having these thoughts and doesn't know channels like ours exist, that's who you can reach. But I think for the majority of the people, like I said, I almost think it's wasted energy because it's much easier to just keep scrolling, right? Oh, why do I want to learn about? They don't even. Most people don't. I would love to know how many people can even name who the Fed chair is. So,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sorry to bear
I'm
that
with you on
bad
that.
news to you.
Yeah,
I know.
no,
I
no,
feel like you want to convert them and say like, come, like, awaken, learn. But I'm not sure if you're gonna be able to reach them. Like, I wish you luck, but it's funny because I think most of my if I speak to a lot of people, even my friends or whatever, they have no clue what I do
right.
on a day to day. They're like, "Wait, what do you do again?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a financial anchor. What do you cover? What?" And when you tell people, when I was really covering gold at Kitco, they're like, "What? What's that? Gold? Like, could you even invest in that?" And it's like, So yeah, I don't know if we'll ever be able to reach the masses.
And also, I'd also say and I don't think people appreciate the anxiety that because no other word to use, the anxiety that those who understanding these dynamics have, right? Because everyone else is going about their day, living life, ignorance is bliss. And then if you understand how some of these intermarket relationships factor into the economy with a lag, you end up not sleeping while everybody else is sleeping comfortably. And then when they wake up, right, then they want more stimulus. It's like
Exactly.
it's maddening.
I'm thinking that we don't really know the numbers that come out of China. We know that they mine their own gold. They have a ton of gold, tons and tons. Central banks are all hoarding gold, buying gold. Um, you can argue whether that's why the price of gold is lower right now, but that's a whole other conversation. But my suspect, like when Frank Jost just spoke about that, I was like, yeah, I don't know if that's the case, right? No one knows, but I wouldn't be surprised where it's a country that loves gold culturally, would perhaps back it. And is that the reason that they've been hoarding all this gold all along? I don't know. It's a theory. All I'm saying is I wouldn't be surprised if they were to, release a digital currency down the road that would be backed by gold.
Final question on my end, and we'll wrap up a tiny bit early because I'm doing another space with Paul Goranson, talk about nuclear and uranium in about a few minutes here. But this is always something that, to me at least, is interesting. So you're interviewing a lot of different thought leaders, a lot of different people. They, let's say, from an underlying threat perspective, all think the world is going to shit. I mean, let's just face it, right? Like, so I always rant against echo chambers, right? But when you are a host of a show and you're interviewing people, if the guests are all kind of having the same sentiment, there's an echo chamber that you're forming for yourself. Also, as somebody who's interviewing these people, and I'm sure just like me, right? You're also investing, trying to figure out what to do for yourself, for your family. For you, as somebody who's interviewing others, how do you think about being contrarian against your own series of guests, and what do you actually do with your own money based on the type of sentiment and things that you hear?
Another great question. Well, I think that any good journalist has to play contrarian and you have to play devil's advocate, whether you agree with them or not, because then you're not getting a balanced view. And so you have to have a natural curiosity. You have to challenge. Let's say even if you have someone on that you 1,000% agree with, and that's why I laugh at the comments. They're like, "Why'd she ask that? Does she think that?" It's like a lot of times, like already know the answer, or B, I'm doing it because I want to get more of their mindset around that or present a challenging point of view because that's what makes for a dynamic interview. So I think if you're a skilled journalist and really care about the profession of journalism and want to keep it alive, well, then you have to play. And there's that delicate balance, right? Like, how do you not piss off your guest and have them back on? So you don't want to throw your guest under the bus, which I feel a lot of times mainstream media does, again, for traffic purposes. So let's not throw them under the bus, but let's take their point of view and challenge it or have them expand on it. And that ultimately will create the best content. And then, yes, it does create an echo chamber, but I think it's important that, again, as a journalist, you stay balanced. You kind of don't get lost in that vortex. You have to do your own homework and research, and you owe it to your audience. And in terms of my investing, well, what is the old adage, right? You have to invest in what you know. So it's I don't think it'd be a surprise to anyone that much of my holdings are in gold, are in the precious metals. Is that a result of the echo chamber? Maybe, but I believe it's more a result of, because I studied it day in, day out for thousands of hours. I'm an expert on the topic. I feel extremely comfortable navigating and investing in precious metals. I sleep well at night. I don't lose an ounce of sleep because I know it. The volatility doesn't upset me. I get it. I am one with it. And it's just due again to the knowledge and exposure I had. And I'm like, okay, I get this. I'm good at it. I can invest in it.
Daniela, real pleasure. I hope this was worthwhile. I try my best. I'm not as good as you at interviewing, but I'm trying to.
No, it was excellent. I feel, it's weird being on the flip side. I always say that, and I rarely do give interviews, but when you asked me, I said, absolutely, you do great work, Michael. Continued success. And I'd love to have you back on my show soon. So let's get that booked, and happy Sunday.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Thank you, Daniela.